Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. All about nutrition from your favorite dietitian. Everything you need to digest in your mind. Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. Making you healthier one bite at a time. With Tony. Woo.
Hello and welcome to the Tips with Tony podcast. I'm Tony Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time. Today we have two very special guests that I cannot wait for you to hear from. I follow them on Instagram. Their content is incredible. They have an incredible podcast, Life After Diets. So we are talking all about kind of what you can expect when you decide to break up with dieting and healing your relationship with food and the process in healing and the things and barriers you might come up against, but why it's worth it in the end. So I'm so excited to have both Sarah and Stefanie here to share a little bit more about what they do and how they can help you say goodbye to diets and hello to food freedom. So welcome, Stefanie and Sarah, to the Tips with Tony podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for inviting us, Tony.
Yeah, my pleasure. Sarah, I love your accent. So Sarah, I want you both to introduce yourself, which I always ask. It's a 3-part question: who you are, what you do, and more importantly, why you do what you do. So maybe Sarah, you go first, and then Stefanie, you take over, and then we can talk about kind of your podcast as a whole.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Sarah Dosanjh, and I'm a psychotherapist based here in the UK, and I specialize in working with binge eating. And the reason why I do it is because I used to struggle with it myself. So that's a big part of what drew me into working with this particular problem. When I trained to be a therapist, I wasn't expecting to be specializing because I thought it might be a bit too close to home. But actually bringing my lived experience into my work is what I try to do because I think it helps people feel less alone and more understood.
Absolutely. I think since you had that personal experience, you probably do genuinely understand your clients better. And I don't know about you, but like I can speak from personal experience of because I'm coaching constantly, I can't go back to those old habits and behaviors because I'm constantly reminded of why I don't want to and the solutions because I have to teach it every day. So I think if anything, it actually keeps you on the healed side, right? Like the more of the maintenance side or like the healing side versus the struggling side, because you have that responsibility every day to kind of show up as the leader to help others. So it's super powerful.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right, Stefanie, tell us who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do.
Yes, I'm Stefanie Michele, and I am an occupational therapist and a certified coach. And I work with people with disordered eating, but mostly binge eating and also body image healing. And I do that because I also have been through that. And that was 25 years of my life, if not more. And as I was moving through all of the ups and downs of my disorder and the healing process too, all I wanted was a hand to hold. That was the thing that I needed the most, and somebody to talk to who understood and somebody who I could relate to. And my career naturally evolved to this place where I'm able to be someone's hand holder every day. And so that's, I have never been in a career path, and I've had a few that feels so right to me. And that keeps me happy to be here every day.
Yeah, it's powerful. And I think a lot of people need the accountability, especially when they're going through a change that you said you struggled with something for 25 years. Most people who struggle with binge eating disorder tend to do it in secret and in shame, and they've been struggling for so long. So it really does take that extra support to really help people make progress. All right. So I would love for you guys to, before we get into the questions I have for you today, share a little bit about Life After Diets, the podcast. What do you usually talk about? What made you guys decide to partner up and teach?
Mm-hmm. So Steph and I have never actually met in real life. We only found each other through Instagram. And I think probably the first conversation we had about it was, Steph, when you came on my YouTube channel and I interviewed you about your story. And then I think you might have asked me to do an Instagram live. And we were doing some semi-regular Instagram lives. We did some Clubhouse things. And a couple of people said to us, why don't you do a podcast? And I thought, yeah, why don't we do a podcast? So last August, that was when we launched it. So
That's
maybe
awesome.
Steph can say a bit about what we talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Because people are listening to this podcast. So that means they're often podcast listeners. So I would love for them to have another reliable resource and just positive brain power kind of as they make that shift. Because, coming from diet culture and just doing all the diets, it's so hard to, even when you recognize you want that change, if you don't have the right people in your ear, it feels like it's almost impossible to change it.
Yeah. Well, the way that we actually structured our episodes and we started titling them was to all of the sort of protests again. I want to stop dieting, but so you'll notice that up until at least the point of this recording, a lot of our episodes begin with but, like, but I still want to lose weight, or what about my health? What about photos when I get triggered by, seeing photos of myself, and all of the common roadblocks we come up against, because it's one thing to decide, I don't want to diet anymore. I need, something needs to change, but that doesn't mean that is that's not without complications or hesitations or doubts and fears and insecurities along the way. So we wanted to address the common things that are coming up for people as they're navigating that road, and the things that we experienced and still experience, and our take on that in a relatable format where we're not teaching or preaching, but we're sharing the stories that we've been through and keeping it real for everybody.
Yeah, I love it. So refreshing. So actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the very first questions I wanted to ask you. There's a lot of times where let me backtrack actually, before we even get there. What are some myths about binge eating? Because I think when someone thinks or associates binge eating, they either look at it for a certain body type or a certain person, maybe even more of a woman, let's say, but men struggle with binge eating too, right? So what are some of those myths that come with, who possibly out there could be struggling with binge eating? And I guess even more to that, what is it? Because here we are talking about it, maybe making an assumption that someone's like, oh, I just overeat, I don't have a problem. Or is my overeating a binge eating problem? So I think maybe before we really get into today's topic, it would be good to just have some framework of what is binge eating and who often struggles with it.
Okay. Well, I'll take what it is. So binge eating is eating a lot of food in a relatively short period of time. But the crucial part is, and the part that we speak to the most, is that sense of feeling out of control.
Right.
That is the most distressing part about binge eating for people. So if someone isn't necessarily eating an objectively large amount of food, but they're really distressed and they're having these out of control bouts of eating, then if they want to call it binge eating, let's call it binge eating. And I think sometimes giving it a name helps people to feel like it's a valid problem, as opposed to, oh, I'm just someone who overeats, or I'm greedy. And that would be my myth number one, is that it's not about a lack of willpower.
Right.
It's not something that you can just stop. And I sometimes say to people, one of the ways to figure out if it's a problem for you is, it seems that the harder you try to stop, the worse it gets. Which is a bit different for someone who might just be doing a bit of mindless eating and eating a bit more than they want to. That, I think, is where it starts to feed into this vicious cycle, this downward spiral that binge eating can turn into.
Yeah. Stefanie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, you stole my willpower. Willpower is always the number one myth. I think that there's this idea that that's what drives binge eating. But I think there's also a stereotype of what it needs to look like, and that people who struggle with binge eating are have given up on themselves, and that they're sitting around and they don't do anything, and they're lazy, and they're maybe a little incompetent. There's a body size kind of stereotype about that, and anyone can be struggling with binge eating from a range of body sizes. That this is not something that affects only one type of person. I have seen, I have clients that I've worked with that are as different can be, as far as careers, gender, sexuality, personality, age, and that this is going on because dieting is such it's pervasive in our culture, and that binge eating is often a response to dieting, but also guilt about food and around food, which it doesn't discriminate. So this is something that's often going on in high functioning people as well, who seem to have it all together, and behind closed doors, there's a lot of shame around not being the picture of health that they might be on the outside.
Yeah, actually, that's very true. I know I've worked with a few people who struggle with binge eating, who by society standards, let's say, are in a body that maybe most people might look up to or think is super fit and like would want to achieve. And so for that reason, it took them many years to even admit that they had a problem. There was even more shame associated because no one even noticed it, right? Even when we think about when you're around friends, if someone's in a smaller body and they're overeating, it's almost like they're celebrated for it. But if someone's in a larger body and they're overeating, and that could be with the loss of control or not, just in general, just the way society views, people in certain bodies, they're almost like looked down on. So it can go unnoticed quite frequently, I found. And it sounds like you guys agree, when someone is in the quote unquote normal body by society standards, it can often go unnoticed very frequently. Yes. So, yeah. So actually, let's stay on kind of this track where someone might actually, because I think part of that is they might not necessarily have a weight issue by, BMI standards or by what the doctor would say, or, weight to height ratio. But I want to kind of go off of this because often I found that when I'm dealing with a client and they're coming from these extreme periods of restriction, but then they're struggling with binging, and now we're healing their relationship with food and they're eating more balanced meals, sometimes they gain weight. And whether they're in a larger body, a smaller body, all that tends to be quite uncomfortable for that person. How do you deal with people who maybe on one side are healing their relationship with food and no longer binging, but now they have this weight gain and they're fearing the weight gain, and they're having a really hard time? They almost like rather go back to the vicious cycle of binge restrict just to be in a smaller body than to accept that maybe by healing their relationship with food and not binging, they might put on some weight. What would you say to that person?
There's always the option that you can go back to the binge restrict cycle. No one is forcing anyone to stop dieting. Right. What Sarah and I have both talked about is, if there was a way that we could stop binge eating and not gain weight, I think that people would be doing that. And that if there was a way to control that would be happening. But what we have found, and I'm going to speak for myself here, was that for me, recovering from binge eating involved a period of weight gain, in my experience, that was part of my recovery process, and I was unable to not have that happen and still recover from binge eating. And in fact, there were many attempts I had to heal from binge eating, but I had parameters around how much weight I was allowed to gain. And I have journal entries and emails that I've gone through to, where I'm saying, I love this food freedom, but I'm gaining weight and this can't go on. And I did in fact relapse, and I went back to the diet and a binge restrict cycle until I reached a point of saturation, and I became so exhausted. I mean, it was mental, emotional, and like soul crushing exhaustion from doing this, that it became like the desire to stop binge eating edged out my desire to keep my body under control, quote unquote, by a fraction of a percent. But it was enough for me to start to look at the recovery process as something that was more important than the body image. And so I allowed myself, I made a deal with myself that I would put my body concerns and my weight fears on hold, on the shelf for a year as I healed my relationship with food. And I promised myself that I could revisit that after I felt more stable with food, if in fact I did. Right. And having that permission to do that was, I believe, critical for me to be able to recover.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that's why we want to build this community, because I don't think it's an overestimation or an exaggeration to say that people are terrified of gaining weight and of losing that control when you've been in and out of the binge restrict cycle. So having that support structure around you, even just listening to other people talking about it, having that reassurance. One of the ways I work with it with my clients is we do this one day at a time thing. So for today, are you dieting today? Can you make that decision every morning, knowing that you can make a different decision? And something sometimes about just having that escape hatch, you can jump back into it if it all gets too much, I think can be helpful to keep people on that path. because they know that it's always there. I think one of the challenges with the anti-diet movement is they tell people you can never diet again, you must never want to diet again, and it's this really absolute black or white thing. And then people think they're failing at the anti-diet stuff because they struggle to fully embody that all the time.
Oh, you're like speaking my language. I literally just instantly my heart smiled a bit, because it's like, I think everybody needs to hear that. There's never one way. It can't be this way or that way. You have to figure it out on your own. And I think also I hear what I think you're saying, and this could just be me projecting, but what I think you're also saying is that there is a time and place where you actually can revisit the idea of weight loss. But what we want to make sure is that it's coming from a place of like, you actually want to, not like you feel like you have to, or maybe like this societal pressure to. And I think, and what's often the case is that people often will, as you heal your relationship with food and you find balance, you like literally start to not care, actually. So, but like, even though the idea is like, you're telling your brain that one day you'll be able to revisit it, I find that with most clients that I work with, it's like they start to realize like, actually, it doesn't actually matter that much. Like we start to unbreak that association, but to get there, you might need to like just tell yourself one day you can revisit.
That's kind of the hope, but we kind of don't give that away at the beginning.
Like, I know.
Let future you make that decision, and the future version of anyone, of course, can make that decision. And just speaking from my own experience, every time I've tried to go back to it, my binging's come back. I haven't ever been able to.
It's hard. Well, and that's the other thing too. And I think that's what the anti-diet community is trying to say. It's like, because they already know that, almost, like, even though it's individualized to everyone, but it's like, we have to let people go through the process, and we can't rob them of that experience. They have to get it themselves. And I think that's where it's great to have people like you who are more so in the middle and just like really just meeting people where they're at, because they'll eventually get to it, but they need to get to it. Also, it's their life and their body and their mind and their story. And, you know, as much as we want to save everyone, like, we can't, but, you know, we can do the best that we can. So I think that's so great. What you guys do is so awesome. I would love to kind of go back to, why do people fear weight gain so much? Where do you think that comes from?
I think, there's a clear societal pressure there, which is probably the most obvious answer, where, this is the messages we get, and it's the ideals that we inherit. And we're seeing this. I think the media is more powerful than we give it. I know we give it credit for being powerful, but I think it's more powerful than we give it credit for. It's constantly, I think, just seeping into your subconscious of the way people look. There was a study done, that said that most people believe their bodies should look a certain way based on what they think other people believe and what they see the most often. And so what we're seeing the most often and what we believe everyone else believes it should be is, there's a silhouette that is, that we're just bombarded with, and anything else is a deviation from that. And so we just believe, I think, from very, very young ages. I have 3 young girls, and I see how young this occurs outside of my influence, that there is an idea that that you just aren't that you're a little bit away from that. And it's always a moving target, and there isn't even a perfection here, but that and especially now with social media and filters and Photoshops and the way that, kids today are inside of those images constantly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the ways that we just blindly inherit that idea. And I think that when you compound that with insecurities of human insecurities that we have, our fears of being vulnerable or being out of control or not belonging or not being enough, that all of that can so easily be poured into, okay, well, it's my body's fault because our bodies can't match this ideal. And so it's easy to say, if I can get my body this way, then that will solve my problems because that gives me control over it somehow. So it's an easy funnel for us to pour all of this into. And I think it takes on a life of its own over time. And it's constantly being confirmed and supported and encouraged by a society who is continuing to send these messages explicitly as well as implicitly in our ear. And no one's immune to that. And I have a 91-year-old grandmother who is still suffering from these ideas. She's
probably from like the Twiggy generation. where
Yeah,
like that was the
before that
ideal.
even,
Before
you know,
that, 91. Yeah, she's not even before that. Yeah.
And it's still a big deal to her. And
Yeah.
you know, I think that it's something I think sometimes you think you'll grow out of, or that will around the corner. You'll be okay. You have this imagined life that you'll be living, and an imagined, I think, sense of confidence too, that you'll somehow rise above this, and it doesn't occur. It's an active process of undoing.
Yeah, I love that. I want to definitely go back to that statement of an active process of undoing. But before we go there, Sarah, I feel like you have some valuable stuff to add to this.
I was only going to add one extra thing. I was just going to say how unhelpful it is for most people who've been stuck in this diet cycle. They have lost weight at some point, and everybody said how amazing they look. And all that constant approval and affirmation, like they've lived it. They've had that experience of being treated differently because of having lost weight, and then thinking that when they gain weight, no one says anything. And then there's all those projections that come in. When you've lost weight, everyone says you look amazing. You gain weight, no one says anything. All those projections fill the space about what must people actually be thinking about me. And that I think is really difficult to let go of, especially when you've been there before. Because a lot of people have dieted once or twice. You can do it, and it gets harder and harder as your brain and your body rebels against that. But just cling on to that idea. I've done it before. I should be able to do it again. And and I think people feel like it's giving up as well, because sunk cost thinking. I put so much energy and effort into this. There's a grieving process sometimes when you're letting go of dieting and letting go of that illusion, that image you had of yourself when you got there.
Wow. Yeah. Let's go there. Let's build off of that. Let's talk about the grieving process, because it is really hard for people to let go of dieting. I often, like when we work with clients, we'll put in small things for them to help with their awareness, like taking pictures of their food, for example. But like, we're not doing calorie counting. We're not doing macro tracking. They're not doing counting points from Weight Watchers. They're not doing any sort of rigidity or nothing like that. And for them, it can feel like scary because they don't have, it's like we're giving them structure, we're giving them guidance, but we're not being like, this is what you need to do and this is what you need to do, right? It's a much more of like, we're helping them to guide them to be able to figure it out. But when they've been following stuff outside themselves for so long, they don't even know where to go or what to do. And that feeling of discomfort often then leads to going back to a diet sometimes if they're not kind of working with us. But I would love for you to kind of speak to what happens when someone, like with that grieving process, like what should someone expect? I guess let's talk about that. What should someone expect going into this process of healing, this process of undoing? What are some expectations so we can let people know that it's normal and it's temporary and it's not forever? Because it doesn't feel very good. So I'd love to kind of talk about that.
Mm-hmm. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for people when you're not dieting is how am I measuring progress? Mm-hmm. You're trying to do this thing, and this thing is an undoing of another thing, and are creating something new. But before, when you're dieting, you've got numbers. You can count what you're eating. You can count weight loss. You've got all these parameters to measure yourself up against. Whereas something like letting go of the dieting, you're trying to go based off how you feel. But there's some complicated feelings going on there because part of you's not happy about that, not happy about letting go of this. So again, that social support element, I think, is crucial. Coming back to it, I don't think this is something you do once. I know it certainly wasn't for me. Over and over again, I've had to reject this idea of dieting, and then times I've slipped back into it and I've had to reject it and reject it. And like you said, when it gets to the point where you're teaching it, you get that reminder every single day. Mm-hmm. If I didn't have it, I think I'd find that quite challenging.
I forget, actually. I'm glad that we're talking about this now because it's a refresher of how difficult it is, because even for somebody like us who we do podcasts about it, we're teaching clients on it regularly, we're writing content about it, like we're basically living it and embodying it, and even we still have those thoughts. Like even we still get those urges, like that's crazy actually. So but that
just speaks to how pervasive it is.
Right.
know?
But it also is just a good reminder for us to like stay humble and to remember like there's, you know, for those who might be struggling with this, like no wonder why they're struggling because we've like are saturating ourselves with it and we still struggle sometimes. So yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's and I talk about that. I talk about my, you know, how I'm confronting that in my own life and how I'm moving through it. And I think it's a practice. I think body image healing is a practice, and it's you have to engage in it the same way you would build any muscle in your body. Like you have to do it consistently over time for it to keep working for you. And I think that when it comes to the grief process, one of the things that I say outright to, you know, to any client the first time we talk and we are talking about body image, I say this could take years. This is not like you take a course and your grief is done. You know, you check that off the list. This is something that is a long time in the making because there's going to be different phases of it and you move in and out of it, and you may feel like you've got this, and then you try on a pair of pants that you used to have and realize that you may never ever wear those again. And I think with clothing, that's a big one with grief. There's a lot of attachment to certain pieces of clothing at different times of our lives, and parting with that or realizing that we may never wear that again. Or that clothing doesn't look the same as it used to, and the access of clothing and the styles available at different sizes that we may move into. And this is constantly confronting us in different ways and at different points of our own emotional experience as we're in highs and lows of our life in other areas where these things creep back in because we're more vulnerable. And so it's learning how to navigate that in an ongoing way, because our bodies are always changing too. Like they don't remain static even when you're recovered. So there's always more to do. There's always something else to wrap your head around. And it's kind of like climbing uphill in the culture, at least, of where we're living. And so you do have to fight for it. And I think sometimes that can be an exhausting prospect. Like, is this going to be exhausting like this forever? And I think it gets easier and you get tools along the way so that you have it happens faster and it happens more efficiently. But it is a practice that goes on, and that the grief will come in and out at different times. And that's something you can learn to sort of sail, you know, you can learn to weather that differently as you go too. But it's not like you grieve and you're done. You know?
Well, I think that was great that you said you can go in and out of it, because literally the stages of like loss and stages of grief, there's denial. What is it? Denial, anger, eventually you get to acceptance.
Bargaining. Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah. Sarah, I feel like as a therapist, you probably like really know bargaining. That's like, you know, all these.
Actually, it's been debunked. The stages of grief has been debunked.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, share with us. Wait, tell me more. Wait.
There's loads of ways of talking about it, but it's exactly the kind of thing we're saying. It's rather than you go through these stages, you're like back and forth, and there's this sort of zigzag diagram that they do now.
Right.
And we talk about it.
They're still the same, but they're just not like linear. Yeah, I didn't think they were linear. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all the emotions come into grief, you know.
Right. So it could be like you could be experiencing two at a time, are you saying?
Yeah. You could experience relief as well in part of grief as well.
Interesting.
Like every range of an emotion could come, because it's change. Grief is change, it's loss. But if you lose someone, even 5 years down the line, you could get a wave of grief for them. And I think it could be the same exactly with this.
Yeah.
That's why I thought of when Steph was saying that.
Oh, great. Yeah. No, I think that's very helpful. All right. Let's see if there's any, just as the podcast Tips with Tony, right? So give tips. Are there any tangible tips or strategies that you can teach? Maybe each of you can share one that are like kind of like your go-to for, even though there's never one size fits all approach, but there's like this one or two things that you always advise, you know, your clients, whoever you're working with, to do to really help them through that healing process. What would you say maybe one of those things are? If each of you want to kind of share one.
Yeah. I think there's so many practical tips out there, and people know a lot of them, and they feel like they keep failing every time they try and implement it, whether it's intuitive eating, mindfulness, whatever it might be. So my tip is about how you apply the other tips, and to do this kind of work, I really believe what it takes is to keep coming back to this attitude of curiosity and compassion. Because if you fall into that beating yourself up, if you fall into a shame hole, if you go back to this, I failed, I've messed up, the same cycle you're in with dieting, we can do it with almost anything. We're playing out our patterns all over the place. So my tip would be, you had someone on a couple of weeks ago, they talked about gritty compassion.
Yeah, JJ.
Yeah.
JJ.
And I liked that because a lot of, when I talk about compassion, a lot of people think, well, if I'm compassionate to myself, that means I don't do anything. I just tell myself everything's okay. And it's not about that. It's just about not being in. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Oh yeah.
It's just not being a dick to yourself, ultimately. Yeah, totally. And it's just trying to find a kinder interpretation, because we're always making meanings out of what we're doing. And it's being a bit more generous to ourselves about our intentions and our efforts.
Yeah, and we're never fair to ourselves. Like never. Like it's just crazy how we can be so critical, so self-critical. But if we were to talk to anybody else, it would not sound like that.
Exactly.
So I love that. So be curious and compassionate. Be more curious and compassionate. I love that. I absolutely love that. Stefanie, what would you say?
You know, as I'm listening, I'm just thinking of the place where I was in, where I had none. I had no compassion or curiosity. I just didn't care. I just wanted to shame myself into submission. So part of the way that I learned how to I didn't have a template for that voice. Like, it just wasn't available to me. And so part of the way that I think I learned that was through support, and that came by way of social media. And I know that that's such an interesting, sometimes social media can be so toxic as far as cultivating a lot of this, but it can also be the opposite if you curate it in that vein. And so following people and having, or even if you're not on social media, but having a podcast, a host of podcasts that you listen to, or support groups, wherever you can find the support. I think Sarah and I have talked about the difference between recovery 20 years ago, 40 years ago versus now, and the accessibility of resources now. And so using them to your fullest advantage, I think it gets the message in faster and more, it floods you. You can flood yourself with this information and learn, how would I speak to myself? What are options for me? Like, I don't even know what that would be. And so when you see a post day in and day out, if you're opening up Instagram every day and you're seeing a post, like you start to integrate what these messages are saying. Or if you're hearing it in a podcast and you start to hear, and then you start to be able to bring that up when you're by yourself in your kitchen post binge and you're feeling like all the shame and all the rage. And you're like, oh, and then that thing comes into your mind. And I think it just gives you that other option. And it's a helpful way of teaching yourself again, to use the resources that we have around us. I think that's part of what community is. And that's the purpose of it, is to help one another. And it's a way of accessing that in a world where we're not talking about this at parties or at the playground with the other moms. Like, there's nowhere else to be getting this except for, you're in therapy or in these spaces where we're feeling that sense of there's more than me who are dealing with this. I'm not alone.
Yeah. And because we just talked about before where this fear of waking comes from. It's really from just society being what we've been bombarded with, the messaging of this ideal body type and what we're supposed to look like or should look like, blah, blah, blah. But what you're saying is that we actually have the ability to shape that a little bit. We have the ability to unfollow certain accounts, follow certain accounts, listen to certain things, not listen to other things. Just like we tell people, I don't know about you, I tell people, like, let's not listen to the news so much. Like, put in some listen to an audiobook, because if you only listen to the news, you're going to have fear at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're only watching, these social media accounts that are telling you that you have to get super, super lean, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. But if that's damaged you before and caused you to binge, then I don't think getting super, super lean is going to help you in the long run. Right. So I think that's really, really, really great advice. This has been great. Let's do a quick plug. What are your Instagram handles? This is perfect timing, so that our listeners have somebody valuable to follow along.
If they want to connect with the podcast, it's Life After Diets podcast on Instagram and on podcast platforms. And my Instagram, Sarah, it's the Binge Eating Therapist. That's on Instagram, and I'm on YouTube as well.
Awesome. I'm excited to subscribe to your YouTube. That will be next. Stefanie, where can people connect with you on Instagram?
Yep. So I am Stefanie Michele on Instagram and on Facebook. I have a free Facebook group, and I have emails every Wednesday that I send out, so you can find me there.
Nice. Okay. So I'll put all that in the show notes. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to add to our listeners? Put a bow on this.
That's a broad question, but I feel like I don't want to give up the opportunity.
It's always a good one. Actually, I went to, I had like this media training many years ago, very fortunate from my old corporate job before I did my business full time. And the one thing I learned in that media training was when they give you the opportunity of what's one last thing, or is there anything else you want to add? That is your opportunity to swing it home. I'll give you some time to let that, but you've done great with these answers. Well, I'll give you, no pun intended, to digest that and basically think of what you want to add. But that is one thing I learned from media training, and it's if they give you it, take it. If they give you, take it. And so.
It was actually a question I had when you were talking earlier, Tony, when you were talking about the way you work with your clients and you get them to take a photograph of their meals as opposed to any other kind of tracking. But then you see those photographs. How do you work with that? The impact of someone else seeing what somebody's eating. Do you know what I mean? Because you become this accountability figure.
Right.
And diets are a form of accountability. So how do you hold that space and it's not they're trying to please you in the way that they were trying to adhere to a diet?
Oh, that's a great question. We remind them constantly that it's just a tool to get you started. So, because if they are used to doing something very rigid, and then we're telling them to do. That's why we don't teach 100% intuitive eating. We're using intuitive eating practices and more mindful eating practices, but we have to meet them in the middle, because if they're used to tracking every single, they weigh everything, they measure everything, they count every point, they've done all this stuff, and now we're telling them to just trust your hunger. Well, they don't even know what hunger is. So we need to create that middle ground for them temporarily until they get to this place where they feel like they can kind of confidently do it without having the photo taking is a tool, just like all these other things are more so a tool. But it's not a forever thing. And it's also for us to really see, for them to also helps them be more mindful. It also acts as a tool for them to just check in for a minute. And then for us to see where are some small changes that can help with their physical health as well as their mental health. Because we know that one of the main reasons people binge is from extreme restriction. So we're checking too to see, making sure they're eating enough. We're telling them what to add in, not to take away. And so that's a great middle ground for us to get them to this place where they can, even like when they document their food, put like their hunger on a scale of like, did they eat when they were at a 4? Did they eat when they were at a 7? Did they stop eating at a 10? Like stuff like that. It's just a really helpful tool in the middle. So that way they're not like flailing around like, I don't know what to do.
It's interesting because when I was going through some of my recovery, part of my recovery phase, it took a long time. One of the things I did for a while, I spoke about this on the podcast, was in the morning, I would record a video to myself and I would set my intentions around food for the day. It wasn't about what I was going to eat normally. It was more about how I was going to eat. I was going to pay attention or whatever it was and I reminded myself, and then I spoke to myself at the end of the day as if I had done it and as if I hadn't. So what would I want to say to myself if I hadn't? And what would I want to say to myself if I had? And then I watched it at the end of the day. And that was such a helpful tool.
Interesting.
And I did that for a few weeks because I think for me, I felt like I was a completely different person in the evening than I was in the morning. I could start off the day raring to go.
Yeah, that's what everybody says. Yeah. So
there was something for me about connecting those two people, the Sarah in the morning and the Sarah in the evening, that I found so useful in doing videos.
That's amazing. Thank you for that tip. That's awesome. I really
like your own accountability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm gonna give that as my tip.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and as a reminder too, like with I think we always teach like energy is your best asset, because we're never our best selves when we're exhausted, whether that's mental exhaustion or physical exhaustion. We're not going to make choices that are aligned with what we want and who we want to be if we're feeling depleted. So we often will like look at those patterns and really focus more on the behavior rather than so much about the food, so that's I think that's a really great tip. Thank you for that. Stefanie,
I've got my something, because I'm thinking about all that we talked about, and from the perspective of someone listening who may, we talk about this all the time, and it's almost like I could think of it in my sleep, right? And for someone who's new to something like this, or hasn't ever talked about binge eating before, or hasn't really looked at body image before, and hearing a lot of this information can be overwhelming. And I think that I think that not feeling pressured to take this all in at one time and master it or like research it all, and just kind of like taking the seeds that get planted, like the things that you may hear that, or a post you may see or a podcast you listen to that's like, oh, that spoke to me and I'm curious as to why, and sort of sitting with letting that grow, letting that marinate, because over time I think one thing leads to the next and they all sort of weave together in the end anyway. So it's not like you have to capture it all in this way and, you know, and get it and understand it now. It's something that evolves, and it can evolve really slowly, and it did for me, and that was I think crucial for me as far as like allowing myself time to integrate it fully, so that it all really did make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You don't need to binge on information.
I never thought of it that way. That's a good point.
So but what I heard is patience. We need lots of patience. I think we always want to like just heal and be better super fast, but because we have that idea and that mindset that it has to happen super fast, we actually take longer than it needs to be, rather than just like giving into the fact that it's going to be longer than probably you expect it, but it's a process, and just be patient. And like all three of us have here shared, it's not just even when you healed, quote unquote, you're still healing. Like you're still going to go in and out of these periods where you kind of need to check yourself or remind yourself of like, I don't want to go back there. Like I do actually love this path, but sometimes we got to like have those hard conversations with ourselves and lean into maybe our therapist or accountability. I'm not speaking for you, but I'm speaking for myself. Like sometimes we need even to lean in on the support a little bit, because you're never really done. But it does get easier. So just to leave this with, so for those of you who might be feeling overwhelmed, just take one day at a time. Sarah said, I think let's just not diet today. Let's just not diet today. Take it one day at a time, and it will get easier. It will get better. And just be patient and replace criticism with compassion. So that seems like a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much for being here. This was awesome. Make sure you're following them on Instagram and you check out their podcast, Life After Diets. And if you're not subscribed to this podcast, the Tips with Tony podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button. A new episode comes out every Tuesday and Thursday. And when you're subscribed, you don't miss a beat. All right, that's it from us today. Thank you so much for being here. As always, this is Tony Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time.